Nice smile, Nicole, anytime.
Agile. I never believe his age.
Good.
Hey, he looks good. Oh, he does.
The ship on which the Sullivan brothers all...
No, they were on the,
I don't know.
it was another ship.
Was it a military ship or was it a service?
And now they have the Sullivan rule. Yeah, I keep saying that too. You just said Korea. Yeah, but they had another brother at home, didn't they? It's in Norway.
Yeah, one was wounded and they brought the other one home with him. I don't know about one still.
Oh, I was thinking about another one where these two brothers were killed.
No.
What is sooner or later?
These girls, one of them was killed. I'm reading about that.
Apparently this is, they scared me. Did you all get a phone call?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh my God, I mean, it sounded like the city was gonna be.
I went for my stress test today. I recall, it was started at 6:15. Yeah. I went to my grandson. Over here. And he said, oh, there's some stuff. So we went and got something to eat.
They just suggested to get here.
Yeah, suggestion.
Yeah, the communication.
Yeah, I mean, it's booked up.
Apparently.
If you could come up and just sit on the floor, just so we can get some of the people who really need to sit down in the chairs to sit in the chairs, I would truly appreciate it. Any of the real young people, we can fit about maybe, I don't know, 8 more up here. Right up front. That's cool, thanks. Can you sit? Cool, thanks. I appreciate it. Thank you so much. Okay, now there'll be some vacant chairs for those who really need to sit down. I'm thinking of people like, well, Mr. Griffin's age, and you know he's a wonderful age. But there's some seats available then, okay? I'll walk around and point them out to you. Thank you so much. We'll be starting at 7. May I have your attention, please? Thomas Griffin will be speaking in just a few minutes. I've kept the doors open to keep the ventilation going here. We have to keep this aisle clear from the group of boys or the people sitting on the floor on. Right where the door opens over there, we have to have an exit opening there, sorry. That door also has to remain clear. That's okay, we made a box seat area anyway, and that door has to stay clear. So does that aisle. What Mr. Griffin has agreed to do is that he will be back here at a very recent date. We're hoping it will be next Tuesday night at 7. For all of those of you who are standing way in the back, we didn't realize we would have such a huge response, but we did. And we're very glad that you've come to listen to this wonderful man, charming man, who's got some fabulous information, historical information. And some of you have heard him all before, and you're back here simply because you like the way he presents his story. So without further ado, I'm going to present Thomas Griffin, the Doolittle Raider. Thank you.
Boy, this is a wonderful crowd. I look out here and I see friends and relatives and a lot of good people, history buffs. All to hear the story of Jimmy Doolittle, one of the great aviators of the first half of the 20th century. I had the very good fortune to fly with him on his first mission against Japan, and then later I had the good fortune to fly with him in North Africa. And this is all hello, 1, 2, 3, 4. Maybe I better not wave this around. Well,
Tom, as if you're on the intercom.
Pardon?
As if you're on the intercom.
On the internet.
25.
Talk real loud, Tom.
Okay. Well, I think the best thing to do is to do a little historical review. You've all heard about Jimmy Doolittle and what he accomplished in World War II. But let's go back a little bit and pick him up right after the end of World War I, when he got out of flying school. The Air Force apparently saw something special in this second lieutenant, Jimmy Doolittle, when he got out of flight school in the early 20s, and they sent him to MIT. And he got one of the first degrees in aeronautical engineering from that institution. And then in the 20s and the 30s, he proceeded to make great contributions to the field of aviation. He flew many record long-distance flights in those old crates. And he had the first in many things. He was the first man that ever flew an outside loop in an airplane. First man that ever took off and flew around and landed entirely on instruments. And that was back in the mid-20s, when the instruments weren't very trustworthy, but he made them work. He had other great contributions. Of course, they had a very popular sport in the late 20s and early 30s, the races around the pylons. And of course, he took those on and won most of those. He was a remarkable man. He also saw the need for 100 octane gas, better gasoline. And he fought for that all through the 30s and got it. And it was a great contribution to our Air Force. Jimmy Doolittle retired from the Air Force in the early 30s, and he went to work for Shell Oil. And they sent him around the world as a representative of their company. And because of this, he learned what the Japanese were doing and what the Luftwaffe was doing in Germany. The Geneva Convention in the 1920s had laid down the rules for the restrictions on nations for what military equipment each nation could be allowed to build. And of course, the nations that became our Axis enemies disregarded these entirely. And when Jimmy Doolittle went around the world in places like Japan and the Luftwaffe in Germany, he realized how much ahead of us these countries were. The Axis countries were just building all kinds of military equipment. And because of the experience he had, he went back to Hap Arnold, who was the head of the Army Air Force in the late 30s. And he said, war is coming. I want to get back in the Air Force. And Hap Arnold got him back in. And in the late 30s, he was a representative between our Air Force and industry for the building of new planes and other kinds of military equipment that we were going to need. So he had a great background. Now, after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, President Roosevelt told his military advisors that they had to come up with some idea of some way to retaliate for that raid. And this put a tremendous burden on them, because what I need now is a little drink of water. Hold still for a minute. I'll get that and I'll have this ready.
Who was that? Roosevelt.
Had to retaliate. That was the big thing. And of course, his military advisors were hard-pressed to come up with some idea of how they could retaliate. Because we didn't have any airfields in those days close enough for our planes to fly to Japan and back. So about a month after the attack on Pearl Harbor, a naval officer saw an experiment being run down at Norfolk, Virginia, where they put two Army B-25 Mitchell bombers on the deck of a carrier and went out about 50 miles off the coast, and these two Mitchell bombers took off from the deck of the carrier. Well, he went back to Washington and he said to the chief of the Navy, why not put a whole squadron of these long-range Army bombers on the deck of a carrier and sail the carrier over off of Japan and have them take off and bomb targets in that country. And it was a good enough idea for them to hand off to Hap Arnold, who was the head of the Air Force. And as I said, he had Jimmy Doolittle, the best man in the world, to hand the job to. And he presented the problem to Doolittle, which was roughly this. Do we have a plane that can carry a ton of bombs, approximately 2,500 miles, and this was the sticker, and get up in the air in 400 feet? And Jimmy Doolittle came back in 2 days and he said, with alterations, the B-25 Mitchell bomber can be made to do this job. Now it just happened that I was a navigator attached to a B-25 group out in the Pacific Northwest. And we were the only group in the Army Air Corps that had these new B-25 Mitchell bombers. We'd been getting them all through 1941 to replace our old B-18s and B-23s. So in order to get crews that knew this bomber, they had to come to us. For the first 6 or 7 weeks after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, we flew off the Oregon and Washington coast day and night looking for whatever might show up out there. The people on the West Coast, of course, were very nervous. They thought the Japanese would be coming and attacking the places in the West Coast. As we knew later, they had no such plans at that time. They were conquering other parts of the Pacific. We spent the whole 6 weeks about, day and night, searching for what wasn't there. Except for one day, I'll tell you, we had a very exciting day. We had our bomb bays open, making a bomb run, when one of our crew said, "That is not a submarine, that's a whale." We closed the bomb bay doors and went on our way. That was the most excitement we had in about 6 weeks of searching. About the 3rd week into January, we suddenly got orders for the whole group to fly to Columbia, South Carolina. And when we got down there, they came to us and they said they were planning on a very dangerous trip. And they wanted volunteers for it because of the danger of the thing. And as far as I can remember, everybody in our group volunteered. After all, we were in the Air Force, we were at war, and I think all of us figured we were going to be on dangerous missions in the days to come. So they sent 20 crews of us down to Eglin Field, Florida. And that's where Jimmy Doolittle first showed up. First thing he emphasized to us was that the training we were going through and the plans we were going to have had to be very secret. Because if our enemy found out what we were planning to do, we would never get to Japan. They had control of the Pacific Ocean at this time. Actually, in the springtime of 1942, for a little historical review, everything was going the way of the Axis forces. The Nazis were driving the Russians back over the steppes of Russia towards their major cities of Moscow and Leningrad and Stalingrad. Rommel was down in North Africa driving the British back towards Cairo. And in the Pacific, after Pearl Harbor, the Japanese had taken over places like Wake and Guam, put a large army in the Philippines, and were in the process of defeating our army there. And they were driving down into the Dutch East Indies for the rubber and oil they could get there. They had control of the Pacific. So Doolittle insisted that we be very secret about what we knew about what we were going to do. We were to write our people and tell them that we were going to be out of the country for a couple of months, and we would contact them as soon as we got back. And then he put us through some very hard training in Eglin Field. And the most unusual part of the training were these boys trying to horse these twin-engine Army bombers up in 450 to 500 feet. The book said that the plane, the B-25 Mitchell, needed a minimum of 1,200 feet to get up in the air. Now, these planes did not have a bomb load. They did not have a heavy gas load. And we never did get a chance to try to take one of these heavily loaded bombers, as it was going to be when we started out on the mission against Japan. We never had an opportunity to try to horse one of them in the air. full of gas and bombs. We trained there. I got a very interesting assignment from the boss in February. He sent me and a fellow named Davy Jones up to Washington, D.C., and we worked with Air Force intelligence to get together the maps and charts of the Japanese islands and the maps of China that we were going to need, and also the target information. Air Force intelligence were able to tell us where the military and industrial targets were in Japan that we were going to use for targets. After we trained there at Eglin Field for until about the third week of March, we then got orders to fly out to Sacramento, California. And when we got there, we stayed there for a week while they leaned on our carburetors and repacked our chutes and did things on the planes. And on the first day of April, we flew over to the Alameda Naval Air Station in San Francisco Bay. And our newest carrier, the Hornet, was in the slip there. It had just gotten in the day before. It had left Norfolk and gone down through the Panama Canal and got up to San Francisco just in time for us to land and get on it. We landed on it, all 20 planes and 20 crews landed on a slip right next to the Hornet. And the Navy, Doolittle flew the first plane in, and the Navy said, we can only accommodate 16 of your planes. So this was quite a blow because we had 20 planes and 20 crews all trained for this mission. And he stood at the end of the landing strip, and as the boys taxied up, he would just shout up to him, how is everything? And if the pilot just said everything's okay, we taxied over towards the Hornet, and a big crane picked us up and put us on the deck. If the pilot, not knowing what an important question this was, said, well, my left engine is rough or anything, that was the way he eliminated 4 crews. However, these 4 crews were taken with us, probably initially for security reasons. However, in the 18 days that we were going to be at sea, these crews were very good for replacement personnel on some of the crews where we made some personnel changes. So it was good to have them along. It was a big plus. After they loaded all our planes on that April 1st, this was April 1st, 1942, we pulled out into the middle of San Francisco Bay and dropped anchor, and we figured under the cover of darkness that night we would sneak out of San Francisco Bay. But that was not the way it was going to be. Late in the afternoon they made an announcement over the loudspeaker that the Army boys could go into San Francisco and have the night on the town. And you know, I still remember that night. It was quite a night. We had to be down at a certain pier at 7:30 in the morning, and the big miracle was that all 80 of us were there on time. What we didn't know was that Bull Halsey flew in from Hawaii that night and met with Jimmy Doolittle in a hotel room in downtown San Francisco. And they all had a big drink of hooch. And they talked over this mission. Bull Halsey was going to be in command of the task force. And among other things, he told Doolittle that if it was at all possible, he would get the task force within 400 miles of Japan. So we headed out under the Golden Gate Bridge the next morning. We found out that the reason Captain Mitcher of the Hornet didn't try to sneak out under cover of darkness the night before was because all the lights were out in the Pacific Coast wartime. He was afraid that he had this brand new carrier and a green crew, and he was afraid he might hang it up on a sandbar someplace, and he didn't want to take that chance. So we went rolling out under the Golden Gate Bridge about 9 o'clock in the morning. And I can remember looking up at the crowds along the rail of the bridge and figuring every 10th one of them was a Japanese spy. But it looked for all the world as though this task force this carrier was taking the squadron of Army bombers probably to Hawaii. After we got out, about a half an hour, an announcement came over the loudspeaker saying that the task force was going to Japan and the Army boys were going to bomb targets in Japan. And a tremendous cheer went up. Now, until that time, the Navy personnel were very upset with us because we came on that carrier and they were full of questions and we had no answers. We wouldn't tell them anything. We were so imbued with secrecy. We wouldn't tell them a thing and they didn't think much of us. We were crowding in. Navy vessels are crowded anyway, and we were crowding 100 flying personnel and 80 ground personnel into places. I remember a sailor took me down in the bowels of the ship, down to a room, and I went in and there were 2 ensigns in there. They had a double-decker bed, and they put a cot in there for me, and they very gleefully told me that they called their room Torpedo Junction, because we were right on the waterline. And this did not help my sleep the next 18 days. I kept trying to figure how that would feel if a torpedo came through that wall there and landed on my cot with me. So we headed out. Now we were in the good graces of the Navy people. And after we were at sea, we had two cruisers and 4 destroyers with us. And after we were at sea about a week, we rendezvoused with Bull Halsey. He had the Enterprise, another carrier, and he had 2 more cruisers and 4 destroyers. And he was now in command of the whole thing. Now we were to be at sea 18 days before we got off of the Japanese shore for our attack. And during those 18 days, we had meetings every morning where each one of our 16 crews were assigned specific targets in Japan. 11 of our planes were going to hit targets right in the metropolitan Tokyo area itself. And one of our planes was going to hit the Navy Yard down at Yokohama in the southern part of Tokyo Bay. And then 3 of our planes were going to 3 other Japanese cities, Kobe, Osaka, and Nagoya, and hit some prime targets there. So we were going to spread it about the Japanese empire pretty much. As we went across the Pacific, our planes took up the flight deck of the Hornet. The Navy planes were down in the hangar deck, and they couldn't be brought up to use to try to protect the task force until we cleared that deck. And there were actually a couple of mornings in the middle of the flight across the trip across the Pacific, where we were told in the morning that if the task force was intercepted that day, our planes would simply be thrown overboard, so the Navy planes could be brought up to protect the task force. That prevailed for a couple of days, and then we had the briefing where if this task force is intercepted today, you boys will take off. You can just about reach Japan and bomb your targets. So that was a day we didn't want too much. But none of these things occurred until the 18th day we were at sea. And the night of the 18th day, we were going to take off late in the afternoon, bomb our targets, fly all that night, and land in our field that was supposed to be waiting for us in China. But early in the morning, the task force went between 2 Japanese picket ships. Our intelligence didn't know it, but they had a line of picket ships 650 miles out. These were fishing vessels equipped with good radios, so that if they saw anything like our task force, they could report it into the main islands of Japan, which they did. However, it took about 5 or 6 minutes for our cruisers and aircraft from the Enterprise to sink these 2 ships, but they had time to radio into Japan that we were coming. Now the Japanese got this message from these picket ships before they were sunk, but they figured they had 24 hours because they knew the range of the Navy planes and knew that this task force had to come another 24 hours for these Navy planes to be close enough to do any damage in Japan. So they figured they had that whole day, 24 hours, to gather together naval units and air units to clobber our task force the next day. In the meantime, we were taken off. Now it happened that this morning, the seas were very rough, high seas, big waves, and a lot of wind. The wind was good, but we had about 25 knots of wind. And the takeoff was this was the first thing we were sweating out, getting these heavily laden planes in the air. They had put rubber gas tanks over our bomb bay and over where the bottom turret used to be, totaling almost 300 gallons, almost doubling the gas carrying capacity of the planes. And we had a ton of bombs. They had taken 200 pounds of radio equipment out of our planes, so we couldn't talk from plane to plane. But we were still overladen by between 1,500 and 2,000 pounds more than we were supposed to carry at any time. And we had to get the planes up in the air in 400 feet. So this was the trick. Doolittle took the first plane off. And of course, they turned the carrier into this wind. Heavy seas meant that the flight deck was rolling and pitching. And each plane took off from a line 400 feet from the bow. Doolittle got off in good shape, as you might expect. But the fellow flying the second plane went up almost into a stall. Well, what happened? The Navy, being kind to us, had dashed out and put 10 5-gallon cans of gas in the tail section of each one of our planes. And plane number 2, when he took off tail heavy, he went up almost into a stall. And he and his co-pilot managed to push that yoke down and get the nose down and stay airborne. They described their takeoff. They said they thought they were going to stall in and land back on the carrier deck. It was that close. But then they put a sign on a blackboard near the island and said, adjust your stabilizers to compensate for the heavy gas load in the tail section. We did that, and all the rest of the planes got off in good shape. We all used that same line 400 feet from the bow. I was in plane number 9, and we were delighted to see 8 planes successfully negotiate. We were feeling real good. But people have said, well, you had 200 or 300 more feet. But it didn't work that way because it was such a tight squeeze. We all were pulled up to that line. We only had 6 feet of clearance from our right wingtip to the island. And that gave us 6 feet from our left wheel to the edge of the flight deck. And if we went 6 feet one way or other, the takeoff was over. And the longer the run you had, the more chance you had of doing that. So we all took that short takeoff, and it all worked. The only casualty that morning, which most of us didn't know anything about for several weeks, the last plane, number 16, as the sailor boys were dragging it up to the line, one of the sailor boys stepped back into the prop and had his arm taken off. That was the only casualty of the morning. Because we were so far out and gas was so precious, there was no thought of forming into formation. That takes gas. Each plane took off, circled around the carrier, checked their compass heading against a compass heading held up by a sailor down on the bridge to make sure our compasses were working right. And then each plane went in on its own. The result was we were all 4 or 5 minutes apart, and most of us never saw another B-25 that day at all. By the time plane number 9 got to the northeastern section of Tokyo, we saw where 10 planes had hit their 8 planes had hit their targets ahead of us, with the smoke and fire coming up. We got there about noon in our plane. We had flown in after we got off the carrier right on the deck so that their radar would not be able to pick us up. And when we got over the city of Tokyo itself, for the first time, we started seeing flak. We'd never seen flak before, and I can remember one of the boys in our crew said, look at these funny little black clouds popping up around there. Well, we caught on quick enough, but that was the first reaction to seeing flak. We went in at rooftop level, which was a good thing. We weren't too able to compete against their pursuits. The B-25B, which was the first plane that came out, and the ones that we had, did not have provisions for tail gunners. So Doolittle, with that same foresight, when we were back in Eglin Field, had broomsticks cut off, painted black, and each one of our planes had 2 menacing-looking broomsticks protruding from the tail section of the plane. And that undoubtedly kept some of their pursuits off our tails. They had a lot of pursuits flying around up there trying to get to us. By flying in at rooftop level, it was very difficult for them to engage us in combat. And it was also very difficult for their anti-aircraft to hit us. They had some anti-aircraft towers around the city. One thing that thoroughly confused the Japanese people, they had had an air alarm drill that morning. And the all-clear signals had just gone off when Doolittle and plane number 1 came overhead and started bombing. And the Japanese people were thoroughly confused about what was going on. A lot of them saw our planes and figured, this is an awful realistic war drill here. And we looked like a bomber, a Japanese bomber. And so they were very confused. I run out of water once in a while. In plane number 9, we flew right in at rooftop level, right over Hirohito's house. But we had strict orders not to bother Hirohito. He was looked upon as a god by the Japanese people, and there would be no advantage to us bombing his house or causing him any harm. So he was not even to be used as a secondary target if we couldn't get to our first target. But we went down to the southern tip of the city and cut across Tokyo Bay to our target, which was a factory right on the bay, which were making tanks. And true to what usually happened in World War II, we flattened this thing. There's nothing much left of us. Our top turret gunner said we did a wonderful job, and the bombardier thought he had too. But instead of bombing our tank factory, he had flattened its immediate neighbor, the Tokyo Gas and Electric Company. It wasn't too bad an exchange. But a lot of World War II was like that, you know. We would have targets here and in Europe, and there would go the neighborhood. Sometimes we hit the targets even. We pulled up to 1,500 feet, dropped our bombs, and we were up there so we wouldn't be subject to our own concussions. Then we dropped back down and flew out to sea about 50 miles to confuse their defenses, as though we were going back out to a carrier. You understand, this plane could get off a carrier deck, but there was no way it could land back on the carrier deck. That's why we had to go onto a field in free China. So after 50 miles out, we turned and we paralleled the Japanese islands for the rest of the day. To give you an idea how long this flight was, from the time plane number 9 took off the carrier deck until we ran out of gas over China, we were in the air for 15 and a half hours. So we had a lot of gas and a lot of flying to do. We flew down paralleling the Japanese islands all that afternoon. About an hour or two after we got off the carrier, the overcast had cleared up, and we had a nice sunny day until late in the afternoon when we got down in the southern tip of the Japanese islands and headed across the China Sea. Now we were flying due west across the China Sea. It was late afternoon, early evening, and we could see a tremendous storm up ahead. Now in our plane, we pulled up to 1,500 feet and we took what you call a wind drift. And instead of having the anticipated westerly wind, which was the prevailing wind in this part of the world at that time, this storm was a mixed blessing. It gave us a tailwind, and it gave us a strong tailwind. Now, until we realized we had this strong tailwind, most of us figured we were going to run out of gas about 100 or 150 miles short of China. This tailwind for 5.5 or 6 hours got us at least to the China coast. Most of our boys were just running out of gas there at the China. Of course, American boys always have to have plans. And in our case, we figured, well, if we're running out of gas, we'll see a ship and we'll ditch next to it, and they'll take us aboard. And if it's a friendly ship, fine, we'll sail off with them. If it's an unfriendly ship, We all had 45s. We were going to take it over and sail it wherever we wanted to go. So that was the light at the end of our tunnel. But this strong tailwind got us to China. 4 of our crews ditched in the water along the China coast. One of those was Ted Lawson, who wrote the book 30 Seconds Over Tokyo. And he tells how he put his wheels down and he was dragging it in to land it, and his wheels hit the white caps and the plane cartwheeled in. And they all lived, but they were all bunged up. And subsequently, a doctor who was on one of our other crews that happened to ditch about 4 miles from Ted Lawson got together with his crew and removed Ted's leg. That's the story of 30 Seconds Over Tokyo. Of the rest of us, 11 of us, see, we couldn't talk from plane to plane. We had to decide each plane what they wanted to do. And we pulled up to 10,000 feet in this storm. Now, it was nighttime now, and we couldn't see our wingtips. It was a big storm. It just happened that we got 300 miles inland in plane number 9, further inland than any of the others, when we ran out of gas and bailed out. Most of the other people bailed out of gas in the province right along the seacoast there that was occupied by the Japanese. Now, we got 300 miles into the next province, and the Japanese weren't there, so we were free of them. But the Japanese did capture 8 of our people. One of the planes that ditched in the water, the 5 men were trying to swim ashore, and 2 of them drowned. And the Japanese captured the other 3. And then they captured one other complete crew of 5 men. There were 5 men in each one of these planes, I guess I told you. And they took those people back to Japan and tortured them, put them on trial. And they decided that 3 of them were to be shot, which they did. They brought them back to Shanghai and shot them, put the other 5 in prison for life. And 4 of them lived through that till the end of the war under terrible treatment. 1 of them died. And there's so many stories, and I could tell you about these different fellas and what they did. But the 11 of us, 11 plane loads of us, pulled up into the storm, ran out of gas, and bailed out. That's 55 men bailed out of 11 planes. And only 1 man was killed. That was amazing. About 5 or 6 maybe had broken, non-death threatening injuries. We landed in the storm. Men ended up hanging over cliffs and up on trees and things like that. In my case, and I can tell you the experience I had when I bailed out, because everybody had the same experience. You bailed out, and after you wait a decent time, you pull the ripcord. And you had a very peculiar sensation. We were in the middle of a big storm, and there was no sensation of falling. The only thing I could see was my chute, and I could just barely see it. And it would go over to one side, and it would collapse. And then it would fill back up and go to the other side and collapse. And I did not have any feeling of movement, as though I was standing still and my chute was doing that. But of course, I was in a big pendulum. And some of the fellas hit the sides of mountains with that and broke legs and things. But I was fortunate. The first indication I had that I was near the ground, a branch of a tree hit my face, and the next second I was standing on the ground. The shroud lines just let me reach the ground. And I tried to pull the chute out of the tree, and it was hung up in there. So I just unbuckled the harness and walked away, and I left all that beautiful silk for some Chinese lady to send her man up to get. We had a very successful mission, really. When we first got together in China, and Doolittle was especially, Doolittle incidentally bailed out also, but they bailed out closer to the coast. And his first reaction, he didn't know where his crews were, he didn't know where the planes were. He figured the mission was a total failure, and that he would probably get court-martialed. He told his crewmates he probably would get court-martialed. And instead of that, as the days and weeks went by, he was promoted from lieutenant colonel to brigadier general, right over full colonel, never was a full colonel. and he was given the Congressional Medal of Honor for training us and leading us on this mission. So gradually, as the days went by, we all felt bad at first when we were down there, and we were, 3 of our crew, I was one of 3 men captured by some Chinese soldiers who didn't know who we were and held us prisoner overnight. But gradually we got together, and the general feeling was it was quite a successful mission after all. After all, it was the first good news that the American people and their allies had. The Japanese had been bombed by American planes. And so there was a big hurrah about that. And we began gradually to come around to that feeling. If people wanted to think this was a big success, we weren't going to argue with them. But we lost all our planes, and you don't like to do that. Incidentally, we had one plane that bombed its target in Tokyo, decided that they didn't have enough gas to ever get to China, so they turned right and they flew up to Vladivostok, Russia, and they landed there, and the Russians took over the plane. They put the crew in a house arrest. Now, the Russians were our allies at this time, but they had their hands full on the Western Front with the Nazis at this time, and they didn't want to have any trouble with the Japanese. So they put this crew under house arrest, and in the next 14 months, they sent them from city to city. And at the end of 14 months, they were down in a part of the country which is just opposite what was then Persia, what's Iran now, and some friendly Chinese, Japanese, Russians. I get it right. I've got too many peoples in there. Some friendly Russians got them over into freedom. I have a funny story I can tell you about that. Morgenthau was our Secretary of Treasury at that time. And all through these months, the Russian government sent him a bill. He got the bill for board and room for that group. and what makes it really outstanding was that these were the months when we were sending millions of dollars worth of planes, tanks, war equipment of all kinds, for which they never paid us a penny. But they wanted board and room for this. And Morgenthau had a running gag with Doolittle. He would contact Doolittle wherever. Doolittle was now a general in command of the 12th Air Force over in North Africa. He would contact him and he'd say, I got another bill for your crew in Russia. Shall I pay it? Doolittle would say, yeah, go ahead and pay it. Sort of a running gag with him. The Doolittle raid was a great success in that it bolstered the peoples of America and England, our allies. The first good news we had. And this springtime in 1942, we needed good news. I can remember telling you earlier about the Axis forces driving towards places like Cairo and Moscow and Stalingrad. If you remember your history, they never succeeded in taking any of these over. This springtime of 42 was the high water mark of the Axis forces. The war went on another 3.5 years. But this was the time when they were at their height, and they never, the Japanese, for example, after Midway, you see, our raid not only was a great shot in the arm for the American people, but had the opposite effect on the Japanese. And they brought back air and naval units to the main islands of Japan to bolster up their defenses. But the main result of the Doolittle raid was this. Yamamoto, who was the head of the Japanese Navy, had been arguing in the high commands of Japan that they were making a great mistake at that time. Their strategy of going down through the Dutch East Indies after conquering the Philippines was wrong. It looked like Australia next. He said, we've got to go across the Pacific and entice what's left of the American fleet out of Pearl Harbor and sink it and open up the west coast of America to attack. Now, he had been getting nowhere with this argument until the Doolittle raid, our little raid. And 2 days after our raid, he was given the green light to do what he wanted to do. And he put together a huge armada. He had four carriers, battleships and cruisers and troop carriers, and he headed across the Pacific. And 6 weeks after our raid, they were going to take over the first objective, which was Midway Island. And you all remember what happened in Midway. Nimitz, who was in command of the our naval forces in the Pacific, had sent our 2 carriers, the Hornet and the Enterprise, and a 3rd carrier, the Yorktown, and he had them sitting up north of Midway, waiting. And when the Japanese attacked Midway, those sailor boys flew down there and sank all 4 of the Japanese carriers, several other capital ships, and sent the Japanese back in terrible defeat. A defeat from which they never really recovered. They couldn't build carriers like we could and other equipment of war like we could. And instead of being on the offensive, if you analyze the Pacific War from that time on, they were largely on the defensive. The war went on another 3.5 years, but they were going downhill most of the time. So I have to figure out how much credit the Doolittle Raiders can get out of that. We were the first offensive thing that got them thinking and got them going for Midway. We put 16 tons of bombs, 1 ton for each one of our planes, on the Japanese Empire. 2.5 years later, the B-29 started coming over in flights of 300, 400, 500, and each plane had 10 tons of bombs on it. So you can see the difference. 2 of those B-29s had more tonnage than all 16 of ours. Ours was just a pinprick. But it had a great psychological effect on the Japanese and headed them in the wrong direction. So we Doolittle Raiders try to get all the credit we can for our little raid. I'll tell you a little about our group. There were 80 men, 5 men in each of 16 planes. We've had a reunion every year, and for many years, when he could, General Doolittle came to all of our reunions. And he died in 1993 at the age of 96. And we thought that would be the end of our reunions. But some city keeps asking us to come, so we go. We only get about 9 or 10 men at these reunions. We've only got 17 of us alive now out of the 80. And the last 2 are going to open up a case of well, it's a bottle of bourbon, is what it is, a bottle of cognac. Back about 40 years ago, one of the cities where we had a reunion made a case of 80 cups, silver cups with our names engraved on them. And they're on display at the Air Force Academy throughout the year. And a couple of cadets bring these cups to our reunions every year. And we have our toast for the departed comrades. And the last 2 men are going to open up the bottle of cognac that's in this display and have the final toast. And I'm looking over these other 16 guys now. Who's going to open up that bottle of cognac? You know, I pretty much told you the story of the Doolittle raid. I wonder if anybody has any questions. I sort of winged this. I might have left something out. Yes, sir.
Did Halsey's fleet make it back all right after you guys took off?
Oh, sure. Yeah. You know, we used to have bittersweet jokes about that. We knew he did the absolute right thing, but we'd be over in China there under pretty tough conditions, and somebody'd say, has anybody heard where Halsey is with his fleet? Somebody'd say, yeah, he was seen yesterday going up the Mississippi River. But he did the absolute right thing. He turned that around and they lived to fight another day. Yes, sir.
You mentioned that that Doolittle became general and in charge of the 12th Air Force in North Africa. Were you in his same group?
Yeah, when we got together after a period of weeks, we were in Chongqing, which was the headquarters city of the Free Chinese, where Chiang Kai-shek had his headquarters. And incidentally, one day when I was there, the madam had about 6 of us over to lunch. We happened to be in the headquarters. And she was a lovely lady, spoke much better English than we did. She'd been gone to finishing schools in the East here. And we had a wonderful dinner, and we went out to the living room of the house later, and Generalissimo came in and pinned medals on us, you know, things like that. And about 4 or 5 months ago, I read in the paper, I lost track of her. She died at the age of 105 on Long Island. When the Generalissimo died on Taiwan, she came back here and was living on Long Island. And she died at 105. But when we knew her, she was 46. Charming lady. Yes, sir.
I understand one of the raiders went back to Japan later as a missionary.
Yes, you know, there are a number of interesting stories with these raiders. Jake DeShazer, one of the boys that were captured by the Japanese, he was in prison, of course, and these guards were so cruel to him and all, that there was a friendly Japanese that got him a Bible. About the last year of his incarceration, he read that Bible from cover to cover. And he made a promise to himself that if he ever got out of this, he would go through the necessary training and go back to Japan as a missionary. And by golly, that's what he did. He came back to this country, spent a couple years in missionary training, and incidentally, his wife happened to be the lady who was going to be his wife, was going through the same school training at that time, and they married and went back to Japan. And they were there for over 30 years. They had a family there. They had 6 children in Japan. And he was responsible for several Christian churches being built in Japan. I was told once that, with the exception of MacArthur, Jake DeShazer was the most famous American in Japan in those years after the war. And another story with him, Commander Fushida, who led the Japanese air armada against Pearl Harbor on December 7th, was converted to Christianity by Jake. And they came back over this country at one time and traveled around speaking in churches. Jake, the Japanese fellow is not dead, but Jake is still alive and lives in Oregon, and he still comes to our reunions. Yes, sir.
After all that you have been through, the war, the Doolittle raid, I know you were a prisoner of war yourself for a period of time. Do you have any personal philosophy of life or words to live by that you could share?
Well, just keep your powder dry, I guess. I don't know what to say. Yeah. It's a terrible situation that in the world today with our boys. It's just terrible. And that's a whole nother story. Yes, sir. What's that?
You were referring to planes, plane number 5, but you do actually have a specific name.
Yeah, we had a name. It was the Whirling Dervish, which doesn't mean a heck of a lot. The Whirling Dervish is a religious sect in Persia or Turkey, where the men dress up with white robes and during their ceremony they whirl around, so they're called Whirling Dervishes. We named our plane that for no good reason. Yes, sir.
Tom, why don't you touch on a little bit on your fantastic career after you got to Tunisia? Tell them about your 2 nifty caterpillars.
We got back to America about 30. We left 3 crews with the newly formed 14th Air Force in China. We went over the Himalayas into India and left 4 crews with the 10th Air Force there. The Doolittle Raiders never flew together as a group except for that one mission. And the rest of us, about 30 of us, flew back to the States. In effect, we went to Africa, South America. We went completely around the world, bombed Japan on the way, and got back. And 5 of us were assigned to a B-26 Marauder group that summer. And we trained that summer, went over the northern route, Greenland, Iceland to England, and now we were in the 12th Air Force. General Doolittle was now in command. And in November, when our forces invaded North Africa, we flew down there and flew for him against Rommel and the German boys down there. Yes, sir.
Mr. Griffin, after you were captured, I know you were sent to Stalag Luft 3.
Yeah.
Were you there when the Great Escape occurred?
Yes, I was.
Any recollection of that?
Yeah. Well, those were all English boys. They had separated. The first American airmen that were captured were put in with those English boys. And some of my friends actually did a lot of the digging on those tunnels over there. But before those tunnels were broken for the Great Escape, all the American boys were put in the same loggers together. So none of us went out on the Great Escape. They were all English. And of course, they shot 55 of them. They shot them as they captured them.
Was there much reaction among the prisoners? Did they announce that, or?
Oh, sure. Well, we were devastated, yeah. Up till that time, if you escaped, got out of there, and we got people out whenever we could, they would capture them and bring them back. Very few men ever got out of the country. Some did, a handful.
Touch on when you were in the B-26, and tell them about the mission you got shot down there, and also the time you got shot down in
Sicily.
in Italy.
Yeah, we were flying, our group was flying, we were one of the first groups in combat against Rommel over there, so, and we took some heavy losses. First, we were skip bombing the ships bringing supplies to Rommel, and that was pretty dangerous work. We got shot down during that. And on July 4th of 43, I was in a group of about 40 B-26s bombing airfields in eastern Sicily. And we didn't know it, but our forces were going to invade a week later. We were softening them up for the invasion, and we got shot down. The group commander was in the plane with me, and they hit us and knocked us down. We had P-38s with us, and we picked up a bunch of Spitfires from Malta, and we had a big air battle with Focke-Wulfs and Me-109s, and then all this biggest air battle I was in. And I had a funny experience. We got time to hear funny experiences? I was going down in my chute, and a Me-109 came right at me. And we had in our briefings after missions, some men would say they thought they saw enemy pursuit strafing our boys in parachutes. And here this fella came right at me. And I was watching for the flashes on his wings, and he went right up over my chute. I thought then he was trying to dump the air out of me. I thought his guns were jammed. He made about 6 passes at me, right at me, and then pulled up and just missed me. So when I landed, he came over about 50 feet, waggling his wings, and I thought, what's the matter with this guy? I'd figured, of course, that his guns were jammed. And the German soldiers got me right there. And that afternoon, they took me into a German general's office in Catania. And I went in, I gave my name, rank, and serial number like you're required to. And I thought, well, I haven't got anything to lose. And I said, Herr General, do you give instruction to your pursuit boys to shoot us when we're coming down in chutes? And I said, one of your Me-109s was trying to get me today, and his guns were jammed. And I told him about the whole story. He heard me out. And he said, Hauptmann, he was not trying to shoot you, he was taking your picture. So apparently this guy had an assignment to go up and take a picture of an American for propaganda purposes, and he picked on me. I've often wondered if I could get a hold of that film, what a wonderful film, and to see if you could read my lips. I was referring to him as the offspring of a female dog. Yes, sir.
Have you ever jumped out of a parachute before you?
China was the first time. Yeah.
Nighttime.
Yeah, oh yeah, it was night in a storm. Yeah.
You don't have to practice.
You had to be scared.
I wouldn't advise you to try it. Yes, sir.
Can you tell us about how nicely you returned the Japanese friendship medals back to Japan?
Oh yeah, that was a ceremony on the deck of the carrier 2 days before we took off. Some Navy personnel and people had gotten medals through the years from the Japanese, and they tied them on these bombs, which we were going to carry. So we returned them with our bombs. Yeah. Yes.
The parachutes that they used in World War II, could you control where they would fly like they could today?
Well, you could, but we didn't have, this was the first time I'd ever, the only instruction I ever had for bailing out was to be sure my harness was snug and count to at least 5 before you pull the ripcord so you shoot the, that's all the instruction I had. And, I didn't try it. There was a big pile of wheat down there that I thought about trying to land in, and then I figured I'm going to dump all the air out of the chute, so I didn't do it. Yes, sir.
Could you tell us about the type of bomb sights you had when the...
Yeah, you see, we had the Norden bomb sight at that time, which was valuable in the red hot item in our arsenal there. The Norden bomb sight was supposed to be so accurate. First, we were bombing from so low an altitude, 1,500 feet. The Norden wouldn't help us much. So one of our boys figured out a sliding scale thing that cost about 35 cents with some sheet metal from a hardware. And each one of our planes had those, bombing from 1,500 feet. And we all hit our targets wonderfully with that. We didn't have the Norden with us. Worked real well.
Was it difficult navigating over the ocean?
On the way in, after about 2 hours, the overcast cleared up, and I took sun lines, which gave us course lines, and flew right into Tokyo. Now, our boys didn't all hit it that well, and we had, as I later found out, planes came in from the south, from the north, and the west, and the Tokyo paper the next day said that Tokyo was attacked by 95 planes. 11 of our planes went in there, and they had 95 of us attacked. Yes, sir.
Mr. Griffin, if you're lucky enough to be one of those 2 people...
I'm sorry?
If you're lucky enough to be one of those 2 people that gets to open that bottle of cognac...
Not if, when?
Well, I was going to say, based on what I've just heard of your life, I would assume that you're probably the luckiest person I can imagine. But what do you think when you and your buddy raise those glasses? What kind of thoughts would be going through your head for flying toast?
Oh boy. You drink the
I
toast.
couldn't hear a lot of that.
What's going through your head when you drink the toast?
If you're one of the 2 people left.
Oh, if I'm one of the 2?
Yeah.
Oh, I have to remind myself I don't like cognac to begin with. That's the first thing. I probably will drink it. Yes, sir.
And after that one, what do you think will be going through your head? What thoughts do you think you'll have?
What thoughts will be going through my head?
What thoughts?
We're the last of the 2 of the 80 men? Well, it's just a farewell toast, I guess. Farewell to a bunch of great guys.
Doolittle got the Medal of Honor.
Yeah.
How about the other pilots?
The rest of us all got distinguished flying crosses. Yeah. Doolittle got the first of it. Yeah.
We were talking earlier, I thought it was interesting that about 10 years ago, a group went back looking for one of those B-25s, but never found it.
Couldn't find it. They looked for, see, there were 11 planes. Well, actually, there were 4 planes in the water off the coast and 11 planes in the mountains and hillsides there. They found parts of it. About 4 days after I was shot, after I bailed out, some Chinese took me up the mountainside to our plane. And as we were going up the mountain, Chinese were coming down with parts of the plane to make pots and pans out of the thing. And when we got out there, the plane had been out of gas and it crashed into the side of the mountain. There was no fire. There was no gas, there was no fire, just all smashed in it. And I crawled through the wreckage of the plane and got my duffel bag out. And I had my uniform in there. And I turned out to be the best dressed Doolittle Raider in China. Yes.
Do you still walk in Veterans Park?
Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed.
Good for you.
Yeah, you bet. Yes, sir.
What was the flying time once you got off the carrier into Tokyo? How long did that take you to get there?
From the deck till you hit Tokyo.
About close to 4 hours. Doolittle got off about 8:30 in the morning. 3 hours, 3.5 hours. He bombed before noon. We were there just before, we were plane number 9. We got there close to 1 o'clock. Yes, sir.
How old were you in 1942 when you went on the raid?
25.
25.
Yeah.
How long did you stay in the military then, after the war?
Oh, I got out when the war ended. Yeah.
Good looking.
Yes, sir.
How old was Doolittle when you were going on this raid?
Doolittle was 46. He was 46. He was 96 when he died. Yes, ma'am.
How long were you a prisoner of war?
22 months. 19 months at Stalag Luft 3, and then the Russians were coming, and the Germans didn't want them to get off. We had thousands of American flying officers and British flying RAF officers in this camp, and they marched us out, and it was, as luck would have it, it was zero weather. And we marched for 3 days and 3 nights to get away from the Russians. Then they put us in the old 40 and 8 boxcars and took us down to Bavaria, and we spent the last 3 months of the war there till it ended.
Tom, you can tell us how old you are now.
I just told you I was 26 at the ridge. You figure that out. I'm not going to tell you. Yes, sir.
How did the Germans treat you after they captured you?
The Germans, of course, they followed the rules of the Geneva Convention, which, of course, the Japanese were terribly cruel to their prisoners, but the Germans weren't. A half hour after the German boys captured me in that wheat field, I was sitting down in a garden grotto there, drinking ice cold lemonade and smoking a German captain's cigar. He couldn't talk German, I couldn't speak German, he couldn't speak English, but we were good friends.
Were you somewhat of a celebrity in the prison camp? Did the Germans know what a feat you had accomplished?
If they did, they never told me.
Is that right?
You never tell them.
Well, we had 3 Doolittle Raiders in the camp I was in, and there was a 4th up at the prison camp on the Baltic Sea. So the Germans captured 4 Doolittle Raiders.
I was thinking there was still some camaraderie between pilots, but I guess that had all been gone by that time. You know, the First World War, there was camaraderie. If they shot down a pilot, they'd take him to the officers' quarters, the enemy, and, you know.
There wasn't too much of that.
No.
That was serious.
How did you make your living after the war?
My living?
Yeah, what did you do for a career?
I was an accountant. I had an accounting office in Chevy for about 30 years. Well, folks, if there's no more, yes, sir.
Where were you born?
Green Bay, Wisconsin.
Oh,
Green Bay,
Green Bay.
Wisconsin, yeah.
You're a Packer fan, huh?
Oh, sure.
Okay.
Still have season seats.
Why did you think the Japanese did not pursue you when you were flying along the coast for like 4 miles going south on the Japanese islands?
They didn't see
Was
us.
the radar no good?
No, they didn't see us.
They were too low.
They just-
Didn't see us,
So
no.
they were really pretty ill prepared.
We got too close to a Japanese cruiser. I think I told you about that.
No, I didn't hear that.
Well, as we were flying south, we could see these Japanese cruisers and battleships heading north. They were going to take on our task force the next day. And we got too close to one of those cruisers, and it opened up on us. And we were right down about 10 or 15 feet off the water. And I thought we'd never get out. They had columns of water all around us. How they ever missed us, I don't know. They must have been awfully frustrated. But we finally flew on, and they never hit us. But the whole ship would be a sheet of flames. They shot everything at us. They wanted us. Yes, sir.
I'm about your same age. I was exempt during World War II. Nonetheless, I want to thank you and all your comrades in arms, and we remember those who gave their lives to protect the freedoms of this great country.
Thank you.